Okay, maybe we will start slowly and people will join us since we have a limited time. Hello, everyone. Welcome to OCASI PSI webinar to SLGBTQI plus Muslims and mental health. I am Onar Ushar, one of the coordinators of the Positive Spaces initiative at OCASI, together with my colleagues Hajim Ismail and Mahta Riazi, who will be supporting today's webinar. We are delighted to welcome you all. Before we begin, I will have a few housekeeping items here. Let me change here. I hope everyone can see my screen. We are providing a third-party live captioning by the Canadian Hearing Services. For those of you who would like to follow the conversation by text, please turn on the captioning if you would like to do so. We will share the edited transcript of the webinar when it becomes available. We will have a dedicated time to have a question and answer period at the end. You can use the Q&A feature on your toolbox to ask your questions or share your comments. You can ask your questions anonymously if you choose to do so. Please note that we are recording this webinar and we'll share the recording on our website publicly for future access. The Q&A section will not be recorded. Rahim kindly agreed to share his presentation slides after the webinar. We will share them with you in the following days along with the webinar recording. Please take a few minutes to complete our feedback form before you leave today's session. Your feedback is important to help us improve. My colleagues Hajim and Mahta will share the feedback link on the chat. And finally, we would like to acknowledge Seyhan Koyukolu from the Riverdale Immigrant Women's Center for creating a beautiful summary of Rahim's recently published articles. We share the infographics with all the participants, and it is also available on our website. While it is meant to complement this webinar, it can also be used as a standalone resource. Now I would like to continue with the land acknowledgement. Actually, before that, just a quick breakdown of our session. We will begin our session with the land acknowledgement, after which I will briefly introduce our guest speaker, Rahim, who will lead our webinar until about 1:10 p.m. And then we will have about 15 to 20 minutes for the Q&A section following the webinar presentation and wrap up our webinar at 1:30 p.m. Now I'd like to share our land acknowledgement before we begin. We would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which we at OCASI carry out our work. It is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We also would like to acknowledge that we are all treaty peoples, including those of us who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generation past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We encourage participants in other parts of Ontario, Canada, or wherever you are on the earth to acknowledge the land that you are on, using a tool like native-land.ca to learn more about the lands we inhabit, the history of those lands, and how to actively be a part of a better future going forward together. At OCASI PSI, we believe that as we advocate for the rights of racialized, immigrant, and refugee LGBTQI plus people and communities, we must do this in solidarity with Indigenous people and in no way at their expense. Today's webinar is organized in recognition of the large gap in our knowledge, resources, and tools for supporting queer and trans Muslims in the immigrant and refugee serving sector, particularly within the context of the rising Islamophobia and anti-2SLGBTQI hate, which is spearheaded by the conservative movement and which targets racialized newcomer, immigrant, and faith-based communities through disinformation. We believe the settlement sector can play an important role by countering this disinformation and providing culturally and linguistically accessible resources. We hope that this webinar will contribute to our collective knowledge to better understand and support queer and trans Muslims, their families, communities, and equip us with vocabulary and resources to address the growing tendency that pits racialized immigrant and faith-based communities from global south against 2SLGBTQI+ identities constructed as white and Western. As queer and trans Muslims, we are here, we exist, and we refuse the erasure of our complex identities and experiences. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Rahim Tower, him, who is a well-known, much-loved and respected colleague, advocate, activist, public speaker, and community leader, among many other hats that he wears. Rahim works as a psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, facilitator, and public speaker, sessional lecturer, writer, and community organizer. He loves all things mental health and is particularly interested in examining innovation in queer relationships. Rahim, it's a great pleasure to host you in our webinar series. Welcome. The microphone is yours. I will first stop sharing my screen, and I will also give you space to share your screen.
Thank you, Onar. And Onar, just a heads up, I'm going to want to share a video at one point, and something on this webinar is not allowing me to share sound. So I might just put that link in your chat box, and maybe you can share it for us later.
For sure.
Oops, sorry, folks. I was just telling my colleagues that I'm a little bit nervous today, and I'm normally not nervous, but I'm quite happy to be here. Talking about LGBTQ Muslim mental health is quite a passion of mine. I spent over 10 years volunteering with Salam Canada, which was a national LGBTQ Muslim organization, and creating community spaces and advocating for our people when we're often overlooked or told that we can't exist, when we're not acknowledged even as people, as a legitimate part of communities. How can our mental health needs even be seen or acknowledged, right? How can we begin to conceptualize what it is, we each need? So my hope today is to take you on a journey to help explore what our needs could be. Throughout this presentation, I will be sharing links to articles where a lot of the material you see in this presentation is replicated, and I've written about previously. I'm going to begin today by talking about Muslims in the world, right? Who are we? Where do we come from? We're not just olive-skinned Arabs. We're much broader than that. People often will say Muslim or Arab, and I think, oh, that's very interesting. There's an immediate association. So let's break that down. And then let's think about mental health paradigms from communities and cultures that are not just Western or white or Western European. And when it comes to mental health, I want us to think about psychological and social contentions that we might experience as people in the world. And they fall into a few categories that I've created, but I think are valuable for us to spend some time on. So the age-old issue or concern that people talk about in our communities is coming out. I don't want to overlook that, although I do want to bring some nuance for what this means and looks like in our communities. I want to both challenge the concept of reconciling identities, but also engage with it. I want to talk about disenfranchised grief. I want to explore internalized negativities. When you internalize negative messages about yourself, your community, your people, your part of the world, who you are, who you're attracted to, how you understand yourself. You take those messages from the world and you internalize them, and what does that look like? I want to consider, drawing on some academic literature, how many of us are working with competing selves, different parts of a fragmented self. And I want to end on a note of talking about resistance and resilience. So what are queer Muslims doing? Who are we? And what resources are already out there? We are an incredible community. And I am always, people will often ask, but do you believe in God? Do you practice Islam? Do you do this? Are you this? And I always say, I need you to pause. None of us need to conform to one way to be. To be afforded the integrity and the dignity to live a good life, right? I care about our dignities deeply without any conditions of how we practice, what we believe, what we feel hurt by, etc. So let's keep that in our minds as we work through this. How do we honor the dignity of people? When we think about Muslims in the world, we might not realize that they make up a quarter of the world's population. So there are 1.8 billion Muslims globally. And we see the largest concentrations of these in South Asia. So those are countries like India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. Then there's Central Asia, so Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, I think Mongolia is also Central Asia. Then we have the Middle East and North Africa. So Egypt, Tunisia, Palestine, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and then Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, of course. There's probably, I think there's a sizable Muslim population also in the Philippines and Thailand. So there's a big concentration there. There's also sizable Muslim populations in sub-Saharan Africa. So South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and then East and West Africa. So on the East Coast, we have Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. On the West Coast, Ghana, Senegal. In North America, as we know, in Europe, and in China, there is a community of Uyghur Muslims that are a highly persecuted minority in the Xinjiang Northern Province. So Muslims are everywhere and they are so culturally diverse. So to say Muslim culture doesn't make sense, we could say there are some commonalities around the world in the ways Muslims observe Islam or in the ways that they pray, but the way they understand Islam and their expressions of faith are also very culturally informed. There are almost 2.6 million Muslims in the USA and about 1.8 million in Canada. So for us to think about these diasporic communities in this part of the world on Turtle Island, right, where we are also part of the settler colonial project, for us to think about how our identities uniquely express themselves and what does it mean to be a migrant? What does it mean to be part of a diasporic community? How do our communities work to preserve their culture and their origins? And when they resist imperialism, they resist erasure, how does that serve 2S LGBTQ Muslims? But then how does that also have negative effects on us, right? Sometimes the preservation of one idea of a culture can be used against a queer person to say, hey, you don't necessarily exist or there isn't space for you in our world. Let's talk about paradigms, mental health paradigms. So I'm drawing on some research here that talks about some perceptions of Muslims, Muslims who were asked about mental health. And one interviewee says, good mental health comes from the unblemished belief in Allah as the ultimate maker and doer, and hence any deviation from firm acceptance leads to disruption of inner harmony. Now, this is very interesting because it tells me that if somebody's having a difficult time in the world, that returning to prayer, ritual, and community could be a basis of harmony, connection, and healing. The negative part of this conceptualization is that if somebody's struggling with something like depression, anxiety, difficulty with eating, difficulty with sleeping, seeing or hearing things that other people are not seeing or hearing, the first go-to would be to accuse or suggest that this person has not been staunch or steadfast in their faith. And that, of course, ends up being a form of blaming the victim. Some people also see mental health problems as a normal part of human suffering. And so there's a positive and a negative to this. So I recall when I was traveling to India many years ago, I was having difficulty logistically with a number of things. And my uncle said to me, you know, I wonder if Allah is testing you. And I thought, oh, this guy, why can't he just say that things are not going in my favor? But instead he has this idea that, you know, this test is like a normal way to think through suffering. Let's accept it and let's move through it. I think there's something very humbling about suffering. So sorry, to think about human suffering as a normal part of life. To live is to suffer, to tolerate the suffering and find joy as part of our work. There's something beautiful about that. It can also be very minimizing and distressing to tell someone that, right? If somebody's going through something very acute, to tell them, oh, this is just part of the way the world is. It dismisses the gravity of what they're personally experiencing. I alluded to this a moment ago, the idea of life stressors as a test of one's faith, right? Sometimes that can be very helpful. It helps you push through a really difficult time where you feel isolated. However, people sometimes will frame queerness or same-sex attraction as a test of one's faith. And the framing of that is, well, you're supposed to be heterosexual. That's what God wants. That's what the natural world wants. And so you having a desire that goes against that is a test of your faith. I think it's outrageous to think that a God or a faith or a spirituality would tell you who to love and who to be attracted to. There's nothing about being a bad human that comes about in same-sex desire. The test of one's faith are for the heterosexual and cisgender community to expand how they think about religious community and faith community. The test is on you to not see us as disposable, to honor us as beautiful, magical beings deserving of dignity and respect. The test is on you to think about how you might rearrange a prayer space and other conventions in our community that leave some behind. The test is on you. Another common conceptualization of mental illness can be about possession or jinn and evil eye. And I know this is true in a number of cultures. So what is jinn or spirit possession? Sometimes the way it's conceptualized is you doing something bad or something you're not supposed to, or you being in a place that you're not supposed to be, and you get possessed. You might also be possessed by a dark spirit that's making you do things as a result of somebody else's black magic or contempt. There is a way to think about evil eye. It is, in many languages, we say nazar or nudger. It is when there's an unwanted gaze upon you, and that gaze is filled with envy, contempt, and hostility. And as a result, you get punished for causing that contempt. So for example, when I was growing up, my mother said, don't eat on public transportation. You'll catch somebody's nudger. So what this means is if somebody looks at you and you have food and they don't, your stomach might hurt later because you didn't share it, or it was rude of you to eat in front of this person. You ate and you made them hungry. And so there's something that I think about in that, which makes me think the lesson was about community and sharing and generosity, but also, and this is important, fear of the evil eye can make us afraid to be proud of who we are. It's in opposition to the concept of pride. So if I celebrate who I am with big flags and marches, that is, make no mistake, that is very important to me, but culturally, it might be seen as a way to invite a negative gaze. So those are some things we need to think about, particularly when working with people who are from Muslim majority countries or cultures, to think about how they incorporate these worldviews into the way they think about themselves. Now, as service providers, I know that we often think about social determinants of health. If we expand it just a touch to say social and cultural determinants of health, here is an important takeaway slide for you. And there'll be two of these important takeaway slides. So this first one is to think about what's harmful. To 2SLGBTQIA plus Muslims, what's harmful is simple. Homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, those are harmful. So non-acceptance, microaggressions, exclusion, negative messages about who we are, non-affirming spaces, all of that is harmful, right? It's very clear to see how those could affect my mental health. What's protective? Perhaps my faith community. I'll pause there for a minute. People often said to me, Rahim, it must have been so hard for you growing up, you know, being Muslim, and I'm sure you have a story. And when people say that, I can appreciate where they're coming from, but I do experience it as a slight microaggression because, in fact, when I was in school, I got made fun of for being a very feminine boy. And people would call me a fag, or that, you know, they would insinuate in different ways that I'm gay. However, when I went to my Jamaat Khana, where I went to pray on Fridays and on the weekend, and I was with that community, those kids that never once made fun of my gender expression, even if I was more feminine. And so I could belong to a group of boys and not feel out of place. In fact, in that community, I was quite popular. So I just want to put this out there that, you know, what emotional and psychological safety looks like is going to differ from person to person. And my faith community was a group of people who may not have understood me. Don't get me wrong, they weren't perfect, but I felt seen, heard, I got a sense of belonging, and they wanted me to succeed. They didn't necessarily get everything about me, but they wanted me to do well because they saw me as an extension of them. So faith community can be extremely protective. Prayer and spirituality and a sense of belonging are also important factors. Now, I think about the small things that really, and I use strong language here, cumulative damage to the psyche, what affects us over the long term, right? People talk about microaggressions as a kind of racist abuse that happens in our culture. People sometimes say, hey, you're out, you're proud, there's communities, you're well represented on social media, there's lots of laws that protect gay people, but the damage has been done when you grow up with so much shame, when you feel like you have to be defensive about who you are. I just did a survey with a group of psychology students in a workshop last week, and the majority of people in that graduate room said that they don't feel comfortable talking about their religious background or affiliation in professional settings. That's wild, right? So that makes me think that people are worried that identifying with a religion is going to make them seem backward, anti-intellectual, fundamentalist, uneducated, literal, all kinds of things. And so they're defensive and they're protective. When you're in that culture and environment where you have to be defensive, you're in fight mode. When you're in fight mode all of the time, that is a protective trauma response that exhausts you. So there's no more emotional availability for other things. So if somebody's in fight mode all the time and you try to tell them to focus on self-care, they can't. They don't have any more resources left. All the jelly beans are gone from the jar. And then they experience things like disenfranchised grief over and over. I will talk about these specific examples on another slide. I do mention it here, for example, the genocide of Palestinians and pinkwashing that we're seeing currently, but I will come back to that. Then there is the self-hate and internalized homophobia and internalized Islamophobia. So every time, actually, let me take a step back. We may have beliefs about ourselves that are not helpful and that are quite negative. And those beliefs were formed by our experiences of interacting with the outside world. And once we've internalized those, the internalized experience of shame and self-loathing gets activated in different social contexts. So it could be when I'm with my family, I'm at the mosque, I'm with my friends, I'm at a dance club, I'm at a social event, I'm applying for a job, or I'm in a job interview, when I'm on the metro getting somewhere. There's different things people say and do, different things people wear, the gazes we endure, where something about us gets activated, where we have to protect ourselves, but also don't like ourselves necessarily. And that's really a painful experience to have to endure over and over. And in our social and cultural environment, what we can create is friendships. Sorry, we can work towards incremental growth, symbols of stability, and a sense of belonging. That's what needs to be nurtured. And that can come from friends, community, reconnecting with, or deciding how you're going to engage with family of origin, creating and nurturing a chosen family, finding and maintaining opportunities to connect meaningfully with others, being seen, feeling heard, and experiencing religion as expansive instead of rigid. That can be very important for a lot of people. Now, the tensions I named earlier, we could also think about them potentially as determinants of mental health outcomes, right? Depending on how you move through this determinant is going to have implications for how you feel overall. And when I define mental health, I think about it as how I see myself, the world, and the future, right? What my perspectives are. It's also how I develop a relation to my emotions and how I'm able to nurture my emotional health. Am I afraid of emotions? Do I listen to them? Do they guide me? Am I afraid of them? Have they served me well? Have they been punished, etc.? So let's talk about this determinant of mental health for 2SLGBTQIA plus folks, coming out. The dominant narratives around coming out usually say that you'll experience liberation. It'll be great. You'll feel freedom, relief, and reduction in stress and isolation. Because for lots of people, it's a secret they're carrying. And they're worried about the weight of that secret or the implication. I sometimes describe it as carrying 20 books in your backpack all of the time. And then you come out to some people and suddenly you're carrying 4 backpacks. Sorry, you're carrying 4 textbooks because so many other people are carrying the other ones. And it doesn't feel good necessarily because you don't have control, but it can feel lighter, right? Then there's pride, an opportunity to think about something you thought was bad as a source of energy, a source of enlightenment. I think about my queerness as like a superpower, you know? It really helps me see the world in a different way. It allows me to empathize and see communities and injustice in another way. To me, queerness is a way of life. It's a way to see things. And queerness allows me to build community just about everywhere I go. So to me, in that way, it's amazing. But those are also assumed benefits of coming out. And that is not everybody's experience. So what are the challenges? Well, when you come out, you can experience a lot of fear of violence, rejection from family and friends. You might lose financial stability as a result. You might worry that you're bringing shame to your family or that you've disappointed people that are important to you. And then as a result, there is lots of loss, right? And what is our response to loss? Grief. And grief shows up in a lot of ways. So you might feel very angry, right? There might be anger throughout a coming out process because you're experiencing grief. Depending on how you come out and whether or not it was your choice, you might also experience hypervisibility, right? People in my therapy practice have talked to me about the awful experiences of being outed. And some say, you know, in retrospect, maybe it was good because then it, you know, a hard thing was done on my behalf. But the scars of not having control and having that hypervisibility are still there. These are the same people that say, I get anxious in a group and I don't necessarily want to share my opinion. And I think, you know, it's possible that there's a connection. And then there is the experience of bullying and violence and being targeted, right? For so many of us after coming out, we continue to come out. We continue to seek community, continue on our journeys of sexual and gender exploration. It's a very important thing to be around other people like ourselves. So for me, I leaned into other expressions of my own gender. I joined groups that were affirming and really beneficial to me, but that comes with visibility. And that does mean that there's a chance I could experience more bullying and violence, right? And I did. And so those are scary things. Now, some racialized 2SLGBTQI folks will resonate with that dominant narrative. I sure did. For me, coming out was important. However, I want to also critique the concept, right? If somebody doesn't want to come out, sometimes the Western lens is to say, hey, that means you don't like yourself. You must be struggling with shame. My question is it private or is it secret? If it feels secret, you might feel shame around it. People have secrecy around things like bankruptcy, about financial problems, about being victims or targets of abuse. People have shame around certain things, and those things are usually deemed to be secretive. But if it's private, then you're saying, I don't have shame around this. I just don't think it's any of your business. Or I don't think it's going to benefit me to tell you. Or you in this environment isn't creating the psychological safety for me to share this information with you. And so in their article, a Latinx writer, Sanchez, talks about the whiteness of coming out. And they say, you know what, I bring my partner to dinner and our family accepts him, you know, like they treat him like family. And if I were to come out in this very explicit way and I demanded that my family accept me in a very particular way and come to pride marches, that demand might erase the nuances of my cultural identity. And they say, you know, he, being the partner, already comes home and has these beautiful interactions with my family. And so to me, that's like what acceptance looks like. And I think that that's very interesting. You know, I think about my own experience in my past relationship where my mom would, when I would visit, or me and Mason, my partner, would visit, she would send food home with us and she would send special food. She'd be like, this is for Mason. And then she'd put labels on it because it's all Gujarati food. And she would say, there's this thing we call like a sambal or a kachumber. And she would write Indian salsa. And it was just so cute, you know? And I really relate with this. I'm like, she's not going to come to a pride march. She's not going to understand the alphabet mafia and all of the politics, but that is what love is. That there's lots of beauty in this. To demand more might overlook what's already being offered to me. Sanchez also says, there must be something for you to come out into, the open arms of a shared experience, the waving of rainbow flags, the 5 seasons of Queer as Folk. Now, if anybody has seen the most recent Queer as Folk, that does give you something to come out into. There's racial and gender diversity. There's a lot around disability and sexual diversity and disability communities. And so that, the world is doing a better job. However, this idea of liberation rests on the idea that there's something nice on the other side, but we don't all have that. And when we go to the other, quote unquote, the other side into queer communities, sometimes they're dominated by the narratives of white LGBTQ history and white LGBTQ ways of being. So for example, if somebody wearing a hijab goes to the 519 Church Street Community Center, her way of being in the world might be seen as threatening. They might see her as not belonging there. They can't compute or imagine that she would belong there. And so it becomes very difficult, right? And so if for her, coming out to her family of origin meant she was going to lose some of them, not that that always happens, but if that was going to, I would be very cautious, because if I were her, I would be thinking, what's waiting for you on the other side? These other people who see just merely the way you dress as a threat, who will be your people then? And I just contributed to this, but I want us to also break this down, right? Dichotomous ways of thinking, like you have to choose between your culture and sexuality. You have to choose between religion and sexuality. You have to choose between your family and sexuality. People in the world think in black and white ways all the time, right? I know this as a therapist, that is a function of how, that is something that perpetuates anxiety. We call that black and white thinking. So our job is to help, and you don't have to be a therapist to do this, to help create the gray space, right? So I see that you see these two things having a fight with each other. When do these two things get along? If these two things were to be friends or to make agreements, what would those agreements be? What would that friendship look like? If they were to merge like a beautiful puzzle, what would that look like? And if a merger was allowed, let's say it was culturally, socially sanctioned as okay. In fact, it was demanded of you. This is your project. You have to merge these two things. Think about it as a business venture. How would you do it? And how would that feel in your body if it was a project around personal growth and development, as opposed to a problem to be solved that's imbued with loss, guilt, and shame? How do we reframe that? Now, one of the things people often struggle with is, some basic resources of how to explain fluid gender identity. And that is a big part of coming out, right? And people might say that trans identities, non-binary identities, those are a Western construct. I like this resource, and you can get it by using the QR code that talks about a map of gender diverse cultures. Now, is this map saying people who are gender non-conforming in all these different parts of the world are having an amazing life? No, right? I'm sure they're having a bad time. I'm sure they've been persecuted in many places. And then another common argument people will say is, well, they might have lived a better life before colonization. You know what? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. I'm not going to pretend that all of these other cultures are more progressive and superior to, a white dominant culture. But I will say that they are rich and they are evolving and they have unique histories and movements outside of white dominant cultures. So let's take a moment to take a step back and see, where have we come from? What are the ideologies and ways of thinking about gender in our countries and cultures of origin? And how have they also been systematically erased? And how do we create space for that, right? It looks to me like there's almost no place on the map where a third gender or another gender conceptualization has not existed. It's existed everywhere, right? So it's time for us to think about who wrote history and why they wrote our people out. That is the question. Why did you do that? It's a funny activity to do, isn't it? To sit in an archivist's room and only tell certain stories. But one only has to turn on the news today to see exactly how history is written in ways that favor a dominant group. The other determinant of health, of mental health, that I want to spend some time on is about reconciling identities. This is a contested thing. Some people say, stop asking us to reconcile identities because you're perpetuating the idea that our sexuality and our religion is at odds with each other. So I would say, yes, important to break that down. In fact, that was the last point I just made. However, it's still a very real thing that people experience. So we have to, if people see it in conflict, we have to honor that. So let's first think about, right? There are we need to break this down. How do you understand yourself as a 2SLGBTQIA plus Muslim? So we have diverse self-concepts, right? A self-concept is a collection of a few things. So in psychology, your self-concept is how you see yourself, how you understand yourself, what your sense of your idealized self is, who you want to be, who you compare yourself to, like your reference group. And your self-concept is also built in with your self-esteem, right? So that's how you feel about yourself in a way. So some people might say, I'm queer and Muslim, or I'm trans and Muslim. And the common retort from another side might say, why do you have to say those two things together? Why do you have to put them next to each other? Why do you have to say queer Muslim? Why can't you just say queer? And why do you have to bring religion into it? Well, because I experience those things together. When I go to a mosque, when I hear a khutbah, which is like a sermon, when I experience things that are gender segregated, when my culture demands or puts a lot of value on heterosexual marriage and production of children, I want to rewrite that. It doesn't work for me. I'm allowed to say that. I just did. Superpower, see? So those things are important for me to keep together. And queer people might say, well, why do you have to also identify as Muslim? Isn't that weird? Well, Islam has taught me a lot. It taught me about community. They taught me about belonging. They taught me about not treating people as being disposable. They gave me a way to think about ritual, to observe holidays. They gave me experiences of spirituality. I don't even have to believe in God to appreciate those experiences of spirituality. I could be an atheist and say, I really appreciated the experience of praying in a congregation. There's something powerful about that. Other folks might understand themselves as religious, spiritual. They might say they're culturally Muslim, and they might say they're agnostic or atheist. Other people will say, I'm born as Muslim, or, I'm Muslim but not practicing. They might say they might also say, Islam is not something I can escape because of my name or how I look or who I am when I'm with my family or the neighborhood I live in and the number of people who know my family, and they're quite Muslim, right? So part of your Muslimness is tied into how you look, how you're read from the outside. When you cross a border, for example, you don't have a choice. I could say, oh, I'm an atheist. Somebody working at the border doesn't care. That's not going to protect me against how Muslims are racialized, right? And they're racialized and equated to threats to national security. So how do you understand that? So the person who is read as Muslim and also an atheist, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection between their negative experiences of being read as Muslim and their desire to distance themselves from that faith community, right? They're tired of what it means to be Muslim or read as Muslim in a white supremacist, racist, Islamophobic society. That's kind of easy to understand, isn't it? Now, what are the challenges and mediators when people try to reconcile these identities? Well, religion in mainstream queer culture is stigmatized, to say the least, because there's no escaping it. Institutionalized religion has done very awful things to LGBTQ people. And in the West, the mainstream religion has been Christianity and Catholicism, and the church has done some awful things to our community. And so part of resistance to that has been resistance to the church and the institution. During the AIDS crisis, the church was advocating for abstinence as opposed to prophylactics like condoms, which do work, right? And so how awful to tell people not to engage in something that's pleasurable and to deem them as sinful and indulgent instead of giving them something to do that would save their life. That in and of itself is an act of violence. So I get that. Are Muslim cultures better? No, no, but if I am from a Muslim majority country, or I am Muslim born in Canada or North America, I might also experience Islam as a big part of my identity and culture. So when I come into a white space that doesn't understand my context, and they think that the way they resist religion or religious community is the same way I am going to, they're mistaken. I can't. I have more to lose because I'm getting a lot more from that community because it's tied to my culture. And that culture is minoritized. It's marginalized. And coming from an immigrant family, there's going to be a strong ethos around cultural preservation. So it's not that I can't resist religious institution and the harm it does. That harm looks different. And the nuances of resistance are going to look different in a community where there's also a desire for preservation and connection, right? So I think we just have to think about what it looks like for 2SLGBTQIA Muslims to have a complex relationship to institutionalized religion, and for them to identify with Islam in a number of ways in a culture that dominantly, it kind of just thinks of religion as backward and hurtful. We also have to think about what are the individual places that the person who we're working with, that we're supporting, seeks affirmation. So many of us are seeking legitimacy and affirmation in different places. If you're looking for a peer group of other people like you, that might be the easiest way to feel good about yourself. If you're looking for an Instagram account, a TikTok influencer that's queer and Muslim, that has a lot of followers, that shares good content, the visibility is there. For the first time in our histories, we are being documented and we're visible in a way that's never been possible before. If you're looking for scholarship and academia that attests to your way of being, that's also there. You have to look a little bit harder, right? And if you're looking for that, there's something about age and class and access and community that also factors in, like, how do you get that rich information? Not everybody has it at their fingertips. Academia and theology in many ways go hand in hand. And a friend of mine, Imam Muhsin Hendricks, who started one of the first gay-led mosques in South Africa. He was an openly gay imam, and he grew up in apartheid South Africa and then went on to learn Arabic and to learn the Quran so that he could dedicate his life to understanding the Quran from a queer affirming perspective. Right? So if we're going to look for affirmation from a scholarly source, we need to look for people who have done their research. And they're going in with the appropriate operating assumptions. If you're reading an old text with the assumption of targeting somebody, with the assumption of looking for legitimate reasons to dehumanize them, you might find them. But also, that's not a good place for me to look for affirmation. I'd rather look for the guy who's dedicated his life to rereading this for all of us, right? And so when it comes to working with clients and service providers, I would ask them, your imam or leaders in your community, people who have a lot of informal authority or informal power. That's the only way I can say it, because we do have some people who are philanthropists or big volunteers in our mosque. They have a lot of power. And to say, how did they treat you? How do you think they would react if they knew that you were queer or trans, you were questioning your sexuality or your gender identity? What might they say? How might they react? What would that be like? And the other question is, if they say, I don't think it'd be very good, the other thing I would say is there something you get from your relationship or your proximity to them that you want to maintain that is positive? This is part of seeing the gray. What can I get from this person that is supportive? And what part of them can't support me that's going to need to look somewhere else? All of me doesn't necessarily need to go somewhere else. Part of me can get my needs met here, and part of me gets my needs met somewhere else. The LGBTQ archives in Canada, which is housed on Isabella Street, they did a queer Muslim history project that outlines the 30+ years of LGBTQ Muslim organizing. And they did it in collaboration with Salam Canada. And I don't know if you can see, but I've just got a smile ear to ear because I'm so proud that they did this, because our histories and our lives really aren't documented in many places. And even though Salam Canada is no longer operating, if you go to the website, there's a list of LGBTQ Muslim organizations globally that are doing advocacy work. So we do have our own histories. We just don't see ourselves represented quickly or easily. And so what that means is there's lots of isolation. People feel like they're doing things for the very first time. People feel like they're very alone and that they're going to have nobody, right? And when they think reconciling identities means leaving religion, there's a lot of grief and loss there, because that means the undertone of that is I've disappointed my community, or I've disappointed God, or I'm not being loved. I'm not worthy of love. Can you imagine that being a core belief you have, to think you're not worthy of love? And then as you're reconciling your identity in the West or in the global North, North America, you face racism and Islamophobia. So we have to educate people about Islam all the time, even when we don't want to. Never once has a Christian person had to educate me about what Christmas is or what Easter is, or why they celebrate it or why they don't, or why they go to church once a year and call themselves Christian, or why they go to church every week, and why different people in their family go to church while others don't. It's just like, oh yeah, whatever, this is how we do it. There's a story there that could be told, but they aren't under a pressure cooker to tell that story. We're under a pressure cooker to tell you the story in a way that's palatable and makes sense to you. Like, that doesn't fit with how, like, sometimes we just want to be, right? We just want to like hang out. Now, this is the video I'm telling you about. I actually think I'm not going to have to put it in the chat box. It looks clickable. Oh, no, because I can't share the sound. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my share real quick. And I will put it in the chat box for you, Onar. And if you can play it and share sound, that would be really great. While I'm doing this, I'm going to remind people there are lots of opportunities here to put questions in the Q&A box, and our facilitators will help moderate them.
I am just going to share my screen. Please bear with mine, everyone. I'm not really sure why this happened, but
No problem. And just share the sound. That's important.
Could everyone?
Yes, we can see it.
When I think of my past, which I do a lot, I keep discovering new connections to where and what I am today. I had to denounce my past for a while to be able to focus on my present. But today, I am in a reconciliation phase. What does it mean to be gay and Muslim? What does it mean to be gay and Arabic? What does it mean to be gay and queer? Questions that go through my mind on a daily basis. I am shaping them, molding them, perfecting them, and destroying them just to shape them all over again. In the end, I see my existence, our existence, to be extremely political.
So I grew up in East Africa and I converted to Islam over a decade ago. And I was initially drawn to Islam because I was searching for a more honest way to relay in the language of integrity and passion. What I did find in my path was that I didn't feel accepted or acknowledged, particularly within fundamentalist conservative notion of Islam because of my sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is what drew me in my quest to draw closer to God, to relearn the ways of the past. And within that, and coming to Islam is what drew me to learning more about my ancestors, because my foundation is reclaiming indigenous African traditions, such as that of my father's tribe, the Bukusu, who have the Dinium Sambwa, which translates as following the ways of the ancestors.
I was born in Scarborough, Ontario. My parents are both from Guyana. I was raised Muslim, raised in a very Muslim family. I always hold my mom in such a high regard. I guess that's why when I came out to her, I felt like I was disappointing her. So when I told my mom that I was gay, she was definitely in shock, but she handled it in the way I should have assumed that she would handle it. She was very strong about it. It's almost like she put up an instant wall when I said it to block off me from feeling any of her emotions. I'm pretty sure like when we got home, she went into her room and started crying. Being Muslim is a big part of my life. My name is a very Muslim name. My family is a very Muslim family. I was born Muslim, like I said. There are certain aspects of Islam that will always stay with me. The morals, the values that I think are in every religion, which I think is amazing. And I keep that with me.
I think being Palestinian is hard enough with the occupation, the colonization, and the struggles that we have to face. And I think being queer and Palestinian is even harder because you become a part of a minority, and hence challenges are not only bigger, but also multi-layered. But on the external side of things, and being a resident of Canada also adds a layer of challenge because I face a lot of Islamophobia and Palestinian phobia from mainstream culture, which makes my challenges within my community even harder to face.
At a very young age, my parents instilled in me that my relationship with God was my relationship with God, and nobody could tell me otherwise. It was a one-on-one personal relationship. I think having that in my life is what made my experience with Islam and my sexuality so positive. I strongly believe that I was loved no matter what, and I was worthy in God's eyes no matter what anybody said. I mean, this being reinforced with having a really amazing family and a great supportive group of friends, I think has made coming out and being an openly gay smiley man fantastic.
They say that human love can be a bridge to divine love. And for me, I believe that to be very true. Whether it's the warm and respectful love I share with my parents, the passionate and committed love I share with my wife, or the nurturing and unconditional love I have for our son. Every experience with my family takes on a spiritual dimension. Non-traditional as it may appear, my family in so many ways is a true expression of my identity as a Muslim. As Rumi says, who could be so lucky? Who comes to the lake for water and sees the reflection of the moon?
Being both Muslim and gay always seemed like separate identities to me. I simply could not be both because I thought they clashed ideologically. But this wasn't a satisfying way of looking at the world. I didn't think that I should have to repent for even being a certain way, yet I began to hide and attempted to find sanctuary in prayer. I wanted this thing to go away. Then I distanced myself from my faith, and later on, eventually, I found true support in queer spaces. I now identify with Islam culturally, and I'm much happier not to be seeking validation from anyone else. Though I say I'm liberated, and despite my so-called resolve, my relationship to Islam has changed, and the label Muslim still brings up a lot of emotion for me, which makes me think that perhaps reconciling identity is a lifelong process.
Somali, queer, androgynous Muslim? How do I reconcile identities that I've been told my whole life are incompatible? How can I assert my Muslim identity while simultaneously claiming my queerness, claiming my right to resist heteronormative ideas of masculinity? How do I claim African ancestry when told homosexuality is un-African? I grew up with a secret. I grew up thinking I was committing the biggest sin. Was it true? Did Allah detest homosexuality? Did he detest me? No. I've since found that my faith, my Muslimness, my relationship to Allah with Allah is not defined by who I'm in love with. I can be queer and I can be Muslim. I can finally live without secrets.
I feel like at first, when I was younger, I could never imagine someone being sexual, let alone being queer. And I never really heard about the word lesbian. I just knew that sometimes I wanted to more than cuddle with my girlfriends. I always knew it was a part of my family's history and culture, but after 9/11, there was a lot of questions around what does Islam mean? What does it mean to you to be practicing? What does it mean to be discriminated against when you are a Muslim? And then when I started meeting queer Muslims in around 2007, and I met my first queer woman, and I fell in love with the queer Muslim woman that I met, it was a real awakening for me because I started meeting women that were challenging the idea that you didn't have to give up one for the other.
I'm a queer Lebanese refugee, raised Muslim, believing in nothing tangible enough to be called a religion, struggling to reconcile identities that seem at first to be polar extremes. I go back to when I was 12, a short stint of devotion pushed forward by sexual abuse. To be more precise, the unpredictable arousal during said abuse. What did it all say about me? So I bowed up and down on a prayer rug, speaking verses I barely understood, raising my hands up and reading the imagined Quran, but mostly trying ever so hard to wash away the shame. I look forward to 16, when there was no longer a question about what it all said about me. The shame remained, intensified by the fear of how Islam would inform my community's reaction if ever they found out. Well, they did find out, and I was damned. So I damned Islam right back, and I've yet to forgive it. Reconciliation? Nope, not yet. Not by a long shot.
Rahim, I just wanted to give you a heads up. It's 1:04, so if you could wrap in like 10, maximum 15 minutes, so we'll have some time for discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, folks, we're back. To me, that video series that Yalda did many years ago is still so powerful. It helps us think about the trauma, the pain, the resilience, and I guess like the creativity, the hardiness, the brilliance of queer Muslims. I want to talk about disenfranchised grief. It's not something that gets talked about very much, and it's defined as grief that people experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged. It's not socially sanctioned or publicly mourned. So what does that mean? Common examples are when the loss doesn't seem worthy of grief, like a non-death loss, for example, an end of a relationship, when somebody dies by suicide or by overdose, we sometimes blame them, or we think, oh, you can't grieve that person. If you have somebody that was significant in your life, but they're not blood related or they're a former partner, your grief might not be recognized. If the way you're grieving is stigmatized, you might not be acknowledged. So disenfranchised grief is something that people experience across the board, but it looks a particular way for LGBTQ Muslims, right? I'm just going to give quick examples of when the mosque was bombed and targeted in New Zealand. We created a community space in Toronto for people to grieve, and queer Muslims came together and talked about the anger that we're hated and attacked And they also talked about not having a place to share that grief because they didn't feel connected to their religious communities. So they're grieving, but it's a disenfranchised grief. Just a few weeks ago, when there was a 1 million children's march, where parents across the country said, we see LGBTQ people and trans people as groomers, and they are brainwashing our kids and they're imposing a gender ideology. First of all, not all of us think that. But that brings up a lot of disenfranchised grief for LGBTQ Muslims, because we are part of the LGBTQ community and we want to say we're proud of who we are, and a lot of us would support a comprehensive sex ed curriculum if it was comprehensive. If parents could do that on their own, we wouldn't need it, but they can't. My brother, who is a father of a 6-year-old and a newly born infant, he said to me, I want my kids to go to a good school where they have a comprehensive sex ed curriculum. And I'm like, really? You can do some of that stuff at home. You know all this stuff. And he's like, no. I'd much rather a professional introduce difficult topics and create a space of learning that I can't do. And I was like, wow, you're admitting that some external body could probably do this better. And he said, absolutely. So the grief here is that different parts of our identity are sometimes pitted against each other. On the official Instagram account of the State of Israel on November 13th, 2023, a soldier from the IDF raised a flag that said, in the name of love, and raised a pride flag. And the caption says that this was the first ever pride flag raised in Gaza. This is so violent to our Muslim communities because it makes us sound like we are backward, not accepting of gender and sexual diversity, and that our non-acceptance is legitimate grounds to bomb a place and to wipe out 15,000 people. Well, we can't work on gender and sexual liberation if some of our people are being bombed. If you have to look for bread, food, and shelter, if you're worried about settlements encroaching on your land, if you're worried about being beaten and harassed, well, no, you're not going to be able to get to a place where you're focusing on gender and sexual diversity within your communities, right? So this is what's called pinkwashing, and it's a way to erase the harms of a particular country. And Israel in 2016, I believe, had a Brand Israel campaign that was designed to make it the most LGBTQ accepting place for tourists in the Middle East. And it did that as a way to respond to a boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement. So it could diminish and minimize its human rights violations. Canada and America are also, they love to do this. They love to say we live in a democratic world and we care about all Canadians. That's not true. Our country does not care about poor people. Every time I leave my house, I am reminded of that. Our country does not care in a meaningful way about Indigenous people. We know that because there isn't drinking water in all Indigenous communities. So it's offensive to say that because we have LGBTQ affirming laws, that somehow LGBTQ people themselves haven't fought for that. And instead to say that the country, the state is progressive for espousing those different ways to be as human rights, because they use our hard-won rights as a way to wash or pinkwash and minimize their other human rights violations. This represents disenfranchised grief for LGBTQ Muslims. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and I know I'm short on time, but I do talk about this in my article, is what it means when we internalize negativity. So internalize homophobia and internalize transphobia. So I think lots of people know about the concept of internalizing homophobia and transphobia. However, when it comes to internalized Islamophobia, you might not be as familiar, right? So some quick examples are when Muslims start policing each other and we say, hey, you're not a good Muslim, or you should do this as a good Muslim. Families say, you should act this way or look like this for the outside world. We start putting ourselves in categories of good and bad Muslim. And I would say that's a response to scrutiny from the outside world. We care about how we're represented to an outside world. That desire to be represented and seen as good Muslims comes from white supremacy. It comes from a desire to be seen as a good citizen and to be seen as a consistent, homogenous group of law-abiding people so that we're accepted and granted a kind of acceptance in Canadian society. There's internalized Islamophobia when we have to prove our Westernness by calling ourselves progressive and assimilating in terms of our national identity, or saying, oh, I'm not like those other Muslims, I'm progressive. So I want us to think about how that Islamophobia gets internalized in the people we work with. Sometimes it means changing how you look or changing your behavior or physical expression. There's a beautiful article that I've cited here that I want people to have a look at when they have time, right? This is the idea of competing selves. Now, Sherry in this article talks about how the conflict between religious and sexual identity can cause a lot of mental health struggles for people. But there's different ways of thinking about these competing selves. So you might see yourself as integrated, like the reconciled person, or you might just accept that I'm always evolving and always fluid. My relationship to Islam might change over my lifespan, over and over. My friend, Imam Al-Faruqaki, says, I'm on my third Islam. And it's a beautiful way of saying, like, you know, it evolves. The way you understand faith evolves over time. If somebody has to think about leaving a faith community or they've felt left, there's a kind of abandonment, and that's a wound we need to attend to. Also, if somebody's doubting the validity of religion in their life, or they have questions about their faith community, that is positive, right? You are engaging in critical thinking. Good. Do more of that, but in the gray, without trying to go to black and white thinking, because that leaves us very isolated. And we need to recognize that some people will question their religious beliefs as a result of sexuality. For me, that was a lens. It was like a new pair of glasses. It's how I'm seeing the whole world. It's my entry point. Other people will not necessarily question religious beliefs with an entry point of sexuality. They might question them for other reasons or not at all. They might have always seen them as quite different. Finally, there's a number of people for whom religion has been weaponized. Their bodies have been regulated, they've been tortured, or they've been outcast in the name of religion. So they have a unique kind of religious trauma to heal from. I'm going to quickly talk about resistances, right? I just want people to know with this slide that within Islam, we are critiquing all of the things. There seems to be a perception that we are advocating for, we're talking about racism in queer communities, but we're never working on our own communities, but we are. We are condemning many things. We saw this in Iran recently, where there was such a resistance when the morality police incarcerated a woman for taking off her hijab. I've been to retreats, conferences where Black Muslims critique the Arab imperialism in Islam and the erasure of Black Muslims. We condemn and talk about the ways that other forms of punishment have been enacted upon Muslims, against queer people. And we in our own communities engage in scholarly and theological readings and textual rereadings So we are doing that work, right? But we're also doing the work of challenging Islamophobia, which I've already described in some ways. Our resistance looks like so many things, right? And these are a slew of people that are imams that are LGBTQ identified. And the first person on the list is Dr. Amina Wadud, who is not a queer person, but she calls herself the first lady imam. And she is a feminist and very affirming of LGBTQ rights. Then there's Imam Muhsin Hendricks, Imam Abdullah Dai, Imam Nur Wasami, who lives in Australia, and then Imam El Farouk Kaki. So there's so many of us. There are films and books that attest to our existence. And it takes just a short look to see what those resources are. There's this beautiful project by author Samra Habib that is called A Queer Muslim Photo Project that was done in North America that you can look at. These are the final takeaways. This is the service provider part 2. So this is what I want you to take away. And this is where some of the questions might even come in. If we're going to support 2SLGBTQI+ Muslims, we need to resist the racist dichotomies and the pressure to buy into homonationalism. So the dichotomies of you pick one or the other. The pressure to say, if you're going to be a true Canadian, you need to get rid of these other parts of yourself. We need to appreciate the nuances of the immigration experience. It's very important not to pedal toward nationalism and Canadian values. Let's not tell people that this country is completely safe and that Canada accepts everybody. That's not going to be their experience. They might have additional freedoms here that they didn't have in other places, but they're going to have now new challenges. That is the truth. We need to use reflexivity to examine our own biases and take cues from, I said here, the young person, but I mean the person we're working with about what the support needs are. People often ask me, what is reflexivity? How do I think about my biases? How do I prepare for tough conversations? This is a quick resource I'm going to show you where Dr. Malin Fors looks at a slew of identities that are oppressed and those that are reflected in the dominant culture. And she's a therapist and she draws a line between where she is and where the client is, just to see what are the gaps between me and the other person. What are the sources of power I have that another person might not? Now I'm circulating these slides so you'll be able to make use of this. When you think about preparing for tough conversations, there's an article I wrote not too long ago about supporting family members when queer and trans Muslims come out. And I address each of these questions, right? And so it could be a resource that you use or that you share with your clients to prepare them for tough conversations. It's particularly helpful if you're supporting a young person in a family, right? Because there's an assumption that, you know, we can't help them because their family will get mad or there'll be a backlash of sorts. Now, I didn't think of all of these brilliant ideas myself. I'm pretty smart, but I have to rely on lots of other brilliant people. And so you'll have access to these resources when you see the slide share. I'm going to stop my slide share and open up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Rahim. I'm just going to, at this moment, would like to stop the recording here.